policy advisor for the Canadian Secular Alliance, and he volunteers at the CFI. He has a degree in mathematics, computer science, with a minor in drama and speech communication from the University of Waterloo, as well as an MBA for science and technology from Queen's University. He writes about secularism, religion, politics, ethics, free speech, and more at opinionsquestions.blogspot.com. Leslie, take it away.
Thank you. And thanks to my fellow panelists, there's been some great presentations. I wanted to start with asking just a very general question of what is secularism, and I'll give a fairly short answer, although it can be a very rich topic in and of itself. As a political principle, the Canadian Secular Alliance defines it as government neutrality in matters of religion. Or another way of putting that is that government should neither support nor suppress religious expression among its citizenry. As you might expect from a policy advisor from the Canadian Secular Alliance, I agree wholeheartedly with this contention. Today, I will talk about the importance of secularism, highlight a specific Canadian policy that, in my opinion, and that of the Canadian Secular Alliance, should be discontinued, and then broaden my focus to encompass a much wider view of the world. In the next 15 minutes, I will discuss Canadian law, international efforts that would impact all of us in Canada, and finally, I hope to convince you that secularism is a necessary, but nowhere near sufficient principle for a just and stable society. To start with, I want to openly acknowledge that overall, Canada does very well on the secular front, and that furthermore, we are generally moving in the right direction. In recent decades, removing restrictions on interfaith and interracial marriage, to liberalizing divorce laws, from the establishment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as the Constitution of Canada, thereby enshrining freedom of conscience, among other things, to formally recognizing gay marriage as equal in all respects to heterosexual unions. Over time, we are moving to a society more and more informed by secular values, and I think we need to recognize this and furthermore celebrate it. This is a good time to be living here. But we must also acknowledge that we do not yet live in a truly secular society. But in most cases, the exceptions, though still substantial, are rooted in tradition, such as the case with prayers opening proceedings at municipal councils, which is still a very common practice across the country that Veronica spoke with earlier. The discriminatory publicly funded school systems in Ontario are grounded in obsolete clauses in the province's constitution, as Gary did an excellent job of highlighting. We must always remember that while freedom of speech is a fundamental human right, as Justin said, freedom from offense is not. Another historical artifact, albeit one with significant consequences for Canadian society, has to do with our charity law. According to the Canada Revenue Agency, an organization must pursue at least one of the following 4 goals in order to be designated a charity. 1, the relief of poverty. 2, the advancement of education. 3, other purposes to benefit the community that the courts deem charitable. Or 4, the advancement of religion. Now, the first 3 items on the list are in accordance with a general understanding of the term charitable activities. Whether or how that last criterion benefits society is far from clear. A bit of history. In 1891, the British House of Lords ruled on what constitutes a charity in a dispute between the tax authorities and the Moravian Church. They developed a common law test based on the preamble of the 1601 Statute of Charitable Uses, which is also known as the Statute of Elizabeth. This ruling is the basis for the Canadian government's determination of which organizations are deemed to be charitable in nature. Perhaps it is time for Canada to reconsider whether a decision made in the 19th century in another country, itself based on the introduction of a law more than 400 years old, is the best foundation for taxation practices in 2012. Yet, we must acknowledge, some traditions die hard. In a letter received by the Canadian Secular Alliance on July 27, 2012, Jim Flaherty, the Federal Minister of Finance, stated, and this is a direct quotation, "Charitable status for the advancement of religion is based on the presumption that religion provides people with a moral and ethical framework for living, and plays an important role in building social capital and social cohesion, end quote. I, for one, would challenge that presumption. In my experience, there is a high correlation between deeply held religious belief on the one hand and opposing the rights of women, the rights of homosexuals, the right to free speech, and the right of freedom of conscience on the other. Furthermore, this phenomenon is not limited to Canada. I submit that strong religious sentiment can have a significant detrimental effect on any society, as recent decades in Ireland, India, and Israel can demonstrate, to pick among countries starting with a single letter. It is important, however, to note that the faithful do not have a monopoly on misogynist or censorious views that lead to social strife. It's one of many causes. But what we're talking about here in Canada is not simply a fine philosophical distinction or an abstract position with little practical impact on Canadian society. Mr. Flaherty's unchallenged assumption significantly distorts fiscal policy today in Canada. The Canadian Secular Alliance obtained from the Canada Revenue Agency a detailed list of charitable deductions made in 2007. Now, all charities must, by law, declare what percentage of their efforts are dedicated to the 4 categories of recognized charitable activities. According to the official submissions to the Canada Revenue Agency, over 26,000 Canadian registered charities did nothing beyond promoting the advancement of religion. This is nearly 1/3 of all charitable organizations in Canada. Not one of them declared that they spent any time, effort, or money feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, or educating the illiterate. In total, they received nearly $14 billion in donations in 2007, and the Canadian government in return granted them tax credits of nearly $1.2 billion. That is over $1 billion every year of government subsidies for religious proselytizing. That's roughly $30 for every Canadian citizen. Now, either these funds are completely wasted, or they are having a significant impact on Canadian society, perhaps not for its improvement. In either case, might these funds be redirected to serve more productive goals? Clearly, despite the progress Canada has made, secularists still have work to do to apply secular principles to Canadian governance and to ensure Canadians do not lose the freedoms we currently enjoy that stem from secular policies. But we cannot for a moment believe that our efforts should stop at our borders. Let us move from Canadian regulations to the realm of international law and attempts to codify freedom from offense as a global norm. As Justin mentioned, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has been agitating in the international community for over a decade to ban speech offensive to Muslims and other religious groups. Of course, the question here, as was hinted at the question period a few moments ago, is not whether there should ever be restrictions on expression. No country provides for completely unlimited free speech. Even in the United States, with its famous First Amendment, has several significant limitations on expression. The canonical example being that it is illegal to falsely yell fire in a crowded movie theater from a Supreme Court justice about a century ago all over Wendell Holmes. Most people support the placing of limits on unfettered speech. Some widely accepted examples include limited and well-crafted laws regarding slander and libel, truth in advertising, and uttering death threats. So, given that reasonable limits exist on free speech, the question is, do mocking religious figures or making other blasphemous utterances fall outside the bounds of acceptable expression? No. The attempts of the OIC to classify satire as hate speech and related efforts have impacts on Canadians just as much as arguments within our own parliament. We cannot be blind to them, and we must act. Similarly, secularism itself is not a default position, even in democratic nations. Though it has not been used in decades, Canada still has a blasphemy law on the books, punishable by up to 2 years' imprisonment. In 2009, Ireland passed a law that makes publication or utterance of blasphemous matter an offense subject to a maximum fine of 25,000 euros. The Arab Spring is replacing several autocratic regimes with democratically elected but illiberal and/or Islamist governments. There are many and complex factors behind the fact that dictators were generally more secular than their elected replacements. But the point is, if we truly respect freedom of conscience as a fundamental human right, there is much work left to be done in the world. Certainly, one's ire should be raised when religious dogma is upheld in the face of contrary evidence, or when governmental policy is used to buttress the faithful of one creed at the expense of those belonging to other groups, including those with no belief in the supernatural. But religion is far from the only example of ideology trumping facts. And many of the most pressing issues facing our world today have nothing to do with religious zealotry or a violation of secular principles. Though some religious folk may welcome the rapture and thus dismiss climate change, humans are cooking the planet with our ever-increasing emissions of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, almost entirely for secular reasons. An all too familiar litany of fear, economics, political expediency, and human short-sightedness. The 2008 financial meltdown in the United States that quickly spread globally had everything to do with greed and fraud. Wall Street made huge profits not by increasing efficiencies, but by maximizing economies of externalities. A greater commitment to secular principles, if possible, would have done nothing to avert or reduce the impact of the real estate and financial crash. The economic crises facing the EU and soon Japan have nothing to do with undue religious influence in the halls of political power. Our current agriculture and animal husbandry practices are almost perfectly designed to evolve a superbug that could wipe out a significant portion of humanity, and this is being done entirely for the most secular of reasons. Since the first human evolved, plant and animal species have been going extinct at an unprecedented rate. We have polluted huge swaths of the Earth's land and water to such an extent that significant areas of our planet's surface are inhospitable to any form of life. Little, if any, of this damage was done with religious motivations at its core. None was committed violating any purely secular principle. So although secularism is important, and more than that, I believe it to be essential, it is also not enough. Not nearly enough, not by a long shot. Most of the key crises we face today as a species, as a global society, have nothing or at most little to do with religion. Secular governance is nowhere near enough to produce peaceful, stable, sustainable societies. We should not waver for a minute in our commitment to secular governance, but we should also not forget for a second that there is much else that needs our attention as well. We must resist all dogmas, whether they be religious, economic, political, philosophical, or even scientific. All areas of human endeavor must be open to scrutiny, question, and refinement. Furthermore, no single approach works across all domains. Science would fail miserably if its findings were subject to a majority vote. Peer review would be a horribly inefficient way to run a corporation. Unregulated capitalism has proven to be a dismal failure if environmental protection and sustainability is a desirable outcome. Yet in their appropriate domains, nothing we have tried as a species to date has surpassed democracy, free markets, and peer review. Consider this. Maybe there is something better out there that we simply haven't tried yet. At a minimum, we need to be open to the possibility, or else this, what we see today, here, now, is as good as it gets. And even more than that, as good as it can get. And I, for one, emphatically do not believe that to be true. Let our legacy be that we bequeath upon our collective descendants a better, more just, more sustainable world than the one we inherited from our ancestors. Thank you.